It's still 2021 and we already have our first smartphone powered by Qualcomm's first 4nm process node technology driven chipset, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1, courtesy of the recently released Motorola Edge X30. But how does it stack up against its predecessor CPUs, namely the overclocked Snapdragon 888 Plus and vanilla Snapdragon 888, as well as the recently released Google-made chipset, Google Tensor, and Apple's A15 Bionic in not one, not two, but three different benchmark runs where we will test out battery drain, heat dissipation, throttling, score, and frames per second. All 5 devices have been updated to their latest available stable software updates, and 4 of the 5 devices are running on 5nm processed node CPUs, with the exception, of course, being the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1, which is of course running on 4nm processed node tech. All 4 of the Android devices within this test are kitted with 12 gigs of LPDDR5 RAM and UFS 3.1 storage, while the iPhone is running half that RAM at just 6 gigs, but better and faster storage, that being NVMe storage. The Moto Edge X30 and Xiaomi Mix 4 are both rocking Full HD Plus displays, while the Samsung Galaxy S21 Ultra and Google Pixel 6 Pro are both running WQHD Plus displays, leaving the iPhone sitting somewhere between QHD and Full HD. The Samsung Pixel and iPhone are all running LTPO 120Hz refresh rate panels, meaning that they can refresh their display between 10 and 120 Hz, while the 2 devices on the left hand side both have high refresh rate panels, that being 120 Hz on the Xiaomi and 144 Hz on the Motorola, but unfortunately they are not adaptive or dynamic, meaning that they will always be fixed at that refresh rate. I've also made sure to enable any form of high performance or game mode on all of these devices, but they're only really available on the 3 devices on the left. The first benchmark that we'll be running through today is Antutu version 9. Next up we have Geekbench 5, which will focus primarily on the CPU part of the test, and lastly we have 3D Mark Wildlife, which stress tests the GPU. Does Qualcomm's new flagship chipset run on 4nm processed node technology have what it takes to outperform not only its last gen chips, but also the best that Google and Apple have to offer? And if so, by how much? This is Tech Nick, and without further ado, let's find out. Before we get things started, we will be noting down the battery percentage at the start of the test, because at the end of the test we'll be comparing each battery drain results in terms of milliamp hour per minute drainage. We'll also be testing out the heat levels throughout each interval being between each benchmark run, with the room temperature sitting around 18 degrees in Celsius. And it doesn't really matter right now which one is the hottest and coolest, but for those of you out there who would like to know the standby temps on phones, the hottest is actually the Pixel 6 Pro at the moment, and the coolest is the 13 Pro Max. At the bottom of the screen you can see that it is to be determined what the temperatures are after each benchmark run, and of course right at the end of the test we'll compare the start to the end temperatures. We're starting with Antutu version 9, and an interesting fact about Antutu version 9 is that it's been around on Android for quite a few months now, but only just recently got added to Apple's App Store. Nevertheless, Antutu version 9 has changed up a bit. The current part of the test that you're seeing at the moment, the alien part, is actually called Refinery. This is the same as Antutu version 8, as well as the Terracotta Soldiers coming up after this has also not been changed. Before the Refinery test, which is this one, it was actually called Swordsman, which was actually added to Antutu version 9. It looks pretty stunning if you ask me. It really does stress test out the GPU a bit, and it replaced that boot one that you saw in version 8. They've also added more user experience testing, mainly added video CTS and added video decoding to Antutu version 9, which will be interesting to see how the new Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 chipset found inside the Motorola Edge X30 competes with when compared to the iPhone 13 Pro Max, especially when it comes to user experience, because I'm really interested to see how things stack up between it and specifically the A15 Bionic, because the A15 Bionic is only a few months old, and even more recent than that is Google's new Tensor chip. But you've got to remember that the latest chipsets from Google and Apple, even though released recently, are still running on 5nm process node technology, so they might have somewhat of a disadvantage. And many people will say, yeah, but those are the last generation of chipsets. But I mean, guys, it's still 2021 and we already have our first Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 smartphone, so I don't think there should be too much of a gap between the best from Google and Apple and the best from Qualcomm. Moving on to frame rates. Talking about frame rates here for a sec, thankfully the new iPhone has 120Hz ProMotion display, and when comparing it to the 144Hz on the Motorola Edge X30, you honestly can't notice much of a difference. I think 120 Hertz is a fair amount of hertz to see on your screen. I mean, I don't think you could see more than 120 frames per second with your naked eye, but it still looks and feels smooth. And, you know, numbers are numbers, the higher the better. Also, many smartphone fans do say. And I must just mention that while Antutu cannot exactly be compared between Android and iOS devices, many of you do say this time and time again every time I do this kind of benchmark test, but it's kind of like not comparing a Ferrari to a Lamborghini. They're made differently. They're chipsets, I guess you could say, within the smartphones as opposed to the engines within the vehicles. But why not compare them? At the end of the day, we're still going to be comparing benchmarks, all different kinds of benchmarks between iOS and Android to see which one we actually want to pick up. And after the first benchmark run, which is Antutu, the Motorola Edge X30 got the hottest all the way up to 50.7 degrees in Celsius, with the coolest being the iPhone 13 Pro Max at 41.2 degrees in Celsius. The Motorola Edge X30 also added the most at 19.9 degrees in Celsius, with the iPhone adding the least at 12.5 degrees in Celsius. And after the next benchmark test, which was of course Geekbench version 5, just testing out the CPU over here, the Motorola Edge X30 is still the hottest now, jumping up to 52.4 degrees in Celsius, but the Google Pixel 6 Pro actually added the most in temp, adding 2.7. The iPhone was the coolest and added the least as well. Now, we just tested out the CPU portion of Geekbench, and now we're testing out just the GPU portion of 3D Mark Wildlife to test out the graphics of all the chips within the chips, that being the integrated GPUs, that being the Adreno 730, the new one in the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1, as opposed to the Adreno 660 found inside the Snapdragon 888 Plus and 888. We do have a Mali G78 MP20 integrated GPU found within the Google Tensor chip, and of course 5-core graphics made by Apple inside the A15 Bionic. So it's going to be interesting to see which one gets the highest frames per second when comparing 3D Mark Wildlife over here, since 3D Mark Wildlife is just so darn demanding. And many of you do say, why just test out 3D Mark Wildlife? Because phones like the iPhone 13 Pro Max and possibly the new Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 chips can actually perform even better using the Wildlife Extreme, but Wildlife Extreme tests things on 4K scale, and 1440p scale is pretty much perfect for all smartphones, so I don't really see why we should compare 4K scales. And ending off that 3D Mark Wildlife run, the Motorola Edge X30 was still the hottest, but this time round the S21 Ultra added the most in temps, adding 3.4 degrees in Celsius, with the Pixel 6 Pro actually adding the least, only adding 0.3, and the iPhone adding the most, matching that of the S21 Ultra at 3.4, but still staying the coolest right at the end of the test. And comparing the overall results in terms of temperature from start to finish, the Motorola Edge X30 was the hottest at 52.9 degrees in Celsius and added the most at a whopping 22.1 degrees in Celsius, whereas the iPhone 13 Pro Max ended off with 44.8 degrees in Celsius and only added 16.1 degrees in Celsius. And when it comes to battery drainage, yes, the Xiaomi Mix 4 drained the most at 11%, but because the Motorola has a larger battery and it drained at 10%, it actually had a worse milliamp hour per minute reading of 27.8 milliamp hours per minute. The iPhone 13 Pro Max had the least amount of drain at 7%, with the smallest battery at 4,352 milliamps, meaning that it got the best milliamp hour per minute drainage of just 16.9. And finally, the Antutu benchmark results. I can safely say that the Motorola Edge X30 is the first phone on the channel to break the 1 million point barrier on Antutu version 9 with a score of 1,02,454 points, which is the first phone that I have ever seen reach over a million, and is currently the only phone rocking this new Qualcomm Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 chipset. He came in first. Second place was the iPhone 13 Pro Max with 813,882 points. Third was the Xiaomi Mix 4 rocking the Snapdragon 888 Plus. Fourth, the Snapdragon 888 powered S21 Ultra, and dead last the Pixel 6 Pro. But even though the Pixel 6 Pro came in fifth place, 736,950 points is still a lot more of a score than I've tested out very recently with the Pixel 6 Pro, and pretty similar to the Snapdragon 888 results. Now, when it comes to single core performance in the CPU front, thanks to Geekbench version 5 over here, the crowned king is still the crowned king, that being the iPhone 13 Pro Max with a whopping score of 1,743 single core score points. Second, quite a bit down from that, is the new Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 chipset found inside the Moto Edge X30 with a score of 1,199 points, and not very far behind that is the Mix 4 rocking the Snapdragon AAA Plus chipset with a score of 1153. Fourth place was the Pixel 6 Pro, which actually beat the S21 Ultra over here with 1,010 points, highest single core score I've ever seen on the Pixel 6 Pro to date. And even though the S21 Ultra got a score of 958, it's actually a hell of a lot better than the single core scores I've seen on the S21 Ultra as of late. Things are pretty similar when it comes to multi-core scores within Geekbench version 5 over here, with first place being the iPhone 13 Pro Max with a crazy score of 4,811. Second place was the Moto Edge X thanks to that Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 chipset, 3,422 points. Third place, still the Xiaomi Mix 4 with 3,330 points, really not far behind in terms of multi-core. Fourth and fifth place have changed here though, with the S21 Ultra getting fourth place with 3,258 points. And then in fifth place we have the Google Pixel 6 Pro, which is arguably the weakest when it comes to multi-core scores because of its clock speeds, with a multi-core score of 2,718 points. And when it comes to 3D Mark Wildlife, hold my beer. The new Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 chipset just beat the iPhone 13 Pro Max's 5-core graphics in 3D Mark Wildlife in this GPU demanding test with a crazy score of 10,042 points, the highest I have ever seen in 3D Mark Wildlife to date, as opposed to the 9,712 points on the iPhone 13 Pro Max. And the Moto Edge X30's Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 powered device got an FPS of 60.1 with a minimum of 41 and maximum of 77 FPS, whereas the iPhone got an average FPS of 58.2 with a min of 45 and max of 60 FPS, meaning that the new Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 chipset is the gaming chipset to beat. Third place we have the, interestingly enough, Google Pixel 6 Pro with a score of 5,779 points with an average FPS of 34.6 FPS. And that's interesting because the Snapdragon 888 Plus powered Xiaomi Mix 4 got fourth place over here, but there was only a 1 point difference between the two scores, making the Xiaomi fourth with 5,778 points with the exact same average FPS as the Pixel 6, with dead last being the S21 Ultra. And though it's dead last, honestly it's not that far off the Mix 4 and Pixel 6 with 5,469 points and 32.8 as an average FPS. So I guess it's safe to say that the new Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 chipset is an absolute monster, especially when it comes to gaming. But the iPhone 13 Pro Max was still the top dog in terms of CPU, single and multi-core performance by quite a margin. I hope that you guys enjoyed watching this video as much as I did making it. This is TechNick, and I'll catch you in the next one.